Hello and welcome back. My name is Ralph Clayton, and I'm your host. This is episode 10 in the Volumetric Time Model series. In the last episode, we talked about the difference between the world and the record. We said reality is not the same thing as what has reached you. We said, you do not live in a magical universal present. You live at the edge of a growing record, a partial record, a delayed record, a noisy record. And we said that what feels like the present is often just the latest layer of accessible evidence. Today, I want to go one level deeper. Because once you really accept that idea, a new question appears immediately. If you do not live in raw reality, if you live in delivered reality, then what exactly is doing the delivering? What is the structure that turns the world into something you can actually know? What turns events into traces? What turns traces into signals? What turns signals into belief? The answer is this: you are living through a pipeline. That is the episode today. The observer as pipeline. And honestly, I think this is one of the most important shifts in the whole framework, because it forces us to stop flattering ourselves. We like to imagine that we simply open our eyes and see reality. We like to imagine that awareness is direct. We like to imagine that what feels immediate actually is immediate. But it is not. It is processed. It is filtered. It is delayed. It is reconstructed. And the thing doing that work is the pipeline. Now, let's start with something so obvious that people almost never sit with it long enough. Light that left a dying star before humans invented writing can still fall onto your retina tonight. Just stop there for a second. That one fact should permanently damage the fantasy that you live in, the present. Because what does it mean? It means the cosmos is constantly sending you traces from things that already happened. Ancient light, delayed signals, postcards from finished events. And your brain takes the latest stack of arrivals and calls it now. That is what is happening. When you look at a galaxy, you are not seeing its present in the ordinary sense. You are doing archaeology with photons. When you hear thunder, the lightning has already happened. When you watch the sun sink below the horizon, you are watching delayed light finally lose the geometry, fight against curvature. The universe is not synchronized to your awareness. It never was. What you call reality is whatever reality Lee manages to deliver to you through physical channels. And those channels are slow, lossy, noisy, and imperfect. That is the starting point. Now zoom in from astronomy to normal human life. Nothing changes except the scale. A friend speaks. The sound takes time to reach you. Your ear turns pressure waves into neural signals. Those signals are processed, filtered, compared to memory, matched to meaning. Even your own body is reporting itself to you through delay. Pain arrives after damage. Hunger arrives after depletion. Fear can arrive before conscious explanation, because some parts of your brain are running fast. Crude threat detection. Underneath the slower story, you tell yourself, the present moment already has a processing history by the time it feels immediate. It has already been edited. And that sounds strange until you realize your own brain openly gives away the trick. Try this sometime. Look at a clock with a second hand while you blink. Often, the first tick after the blink feels slightly longer. Why? Because your brain is stitching continuity together. It backfills, it smooths, it edits the broadcast. The stream feels seamless, but it is not raw. It is the output of a pipeline. That word matters a lot. Pipeline. Because it shifts the conversation away from vague philosophy and toward physical process. A pipeline means this. Something happens in the world. A sensor picks up some trace of it. That trace gets converted into a signal. The signal gets sampled, compressed, transmitted, decoded, interpreted. And only then does it become something like a belief inside you. That is a pipeline. And once you see that structure, a brutal conclusion follows. The world you experience is not the world as it is. It is the world as your pipeline can deliver it. That is a much harsher sentence than it first appears, because it means access is not a philosophical privilege. Access is a manufactured product. It is made by sensors, channels, storage, attention, and decoding. Every stage introduces limits. Every stage discards information. Every stage adds delay. Every stage can be biased. And that is why two people can stand in the same event and still inhabit different, practical realities. Not because reality itself split into fantasy, because their pipelines differ. One person has better sensors, or better timing, or better training, or better models, or simply less noise. The world is the same. The accessible record is not. That is one of the deepest ideas in this whole series. Now, if that still feels too abstract, think about how a serious scientific instrument actually sees. Take a gravitational wave observatory. When two black holes collide, the detector does not watch them the way your eyes watch fireworks. It does not get a neat little cosmic movie. It measures absurdly tiny changes in distance. Tiny distortions buried under environmental vibration, thermal jitter, background fluctuations, and instrument noise. The raw world is basically unreadable. So what happens? Calibration happens. Filtering happens. Known contaminants get subtracted. Signals are checked across detectors. Patterns are matched against templates. And after all that, a trace emerges. A chirp, a signal with enough structure to survive the noise. Then the human story gets told. Two massive objects merged. Space-time rang. Energy rippled outward. But the collision did not become real when the chirp was announced. It became accessible. That is a very different thing. And your daily life is full of smaller versions of that exact same structure. Your phone does not just know where you are. It combines satellite timing, signal geometry, inertial sensors, map assumptions, and statistical smoothing. Your sleep tracker does not watch your soul drifting through sleep. It infers probable states from a small set of noisy proxies. Your car's assistance system does not perceive lane boundaries the way a philosopher imagines perception. It processes pixels under glare, rain, shadows, and uncertainty. Again and again. What modern life teaches you is this. Direct perception is being replaced by pipelines that convert messy reality into legible summaries. And those summaries arrive with delay, with uncertainty, with assumptions hidden under the hood. That is why access is never neutral. Access is engineered, and the engineering shapes belief. Now I want to name the three main enemies every pipeline faces. Because once you have these three in mind, you start seeing them everywhere. Bandwidth, Norton's latency. Bandwidth is how much information can pass through the channel in a given time. Noise is everything contaminating the signal. Latency is delay between the event and the arrival of its usable trace. Those three words explain a huge amount of human confusion. Bandwidth matters because no observer can take in everything. Even your eyes are bottlenecked. Even your attention is selective. Even your memory compresses. Noise matters because signals rarely arrive alone. They arrive mixed with interference, missing context, irrelevant variation, and background clutter. And latency matters because a delayed truth is often experienced as a new truth. That is one of the great mistakes of embodied life. The mind keeps confusing arrival time with existence time. Something reaches you now, so it feels as if it became real now. But that is not what happened. The trace arrived now. The event may be much older. That confusion is understandable. It is also one of the reasons people get blindsided. Now here is where things become more subtle. A pipeline does not merely report the world. It helps create your experience of temporal flow. Why does time feel like it moves in one direction? Because your accessible record grows in one direction. Memory accumulates, evidence arrives, signals enter storage. The distinction between before the trace arrived and after the trace arrived becomes the felt arrow. That is an extraordinary point. The universe does not need a metaphysical arrow written into every inch of reality for you to feel one. Your record provides the arrow. Your pipeline provides the arrow. The present feels special because it is the boundary between what your pipeline has delivered and what it has not yet delivered. Not necessarily a cosmic fence. A local informational boundary written into you. That idea solves a lot of weirdness. Why do people who watch the same event disagree so violently about what happened? Because they did not actually receive the same event. They received different processed outputs, different compression, different attention, different timing, different bias. One person caught the opening and missed the end. Another caught the end and guessed backward. One person focused on one cue and filtered out another. That is not a comforting answer, but it is often the right one. And once you accept it, something else becomes easier to explain. Why does a late lab result suddenly change behavior? Why does one number suddenly make everyone act as if reality changed? It is not because the body changed at that moment. It is because the pipeline finally produced a trace in a socially actionable format. A number, a timestamp, a defensible artifact. That matters because groups do not act on raw truth. Groups act on accessible, legible, defensible traces. And that brings us to a really important point. Credibility is also a channel property. Some evidence arrives in a form people can defend. Other evidence arrives as intuition, vague unease, or pattern recognition without a clean printout. The world itself does not care about format. Humans do. That means early evidence can be correct and still ignored because it arrives weakly. Late evidence can be less informative and still drive action because it arrives with authority. A graph beats a gut feeling. A printed number beats quiet dread. That does not mean the graph is deeper reality. It means the graph survived the social pipeline. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Now, let's make this personal. Your mind is not one clean observer. It is full of pipeline disagreement. Some signals inside you are fast and crude. Some are slow and detailed. Some parts of you respond before the narrator catches up. That is why you can feel unsafe before you know. Why? Or feel safe when danger is real. Or realize later that you knew something before you could say it. Your own mind is layered processing. The narrator is late. The pipeline is braided. And once you see that, the fantasy of a simple unified self standing in a clean present starts to break down. You are more like a system receiving and integrating differently timed streams. That does not make you unreal. It makes you more physically plausible. Now I want to go one step further, because this is where the observer, as pipeline idea becomes ruthless. A pipeline does not just passively receive, it samples, it compresses, it interprets. Those are the three brutal moves: sample, compress, interpret. Sampling means taking a continuous world and grabbing discrete traces. And this is where aliasing comes in. Aliasing is what happens when you sample too slowly and reality lies to you through the gaps. A spinning wheel looks like it is moving backward. A flickering light looks steady. A fast instability looks like a slow drift. In life, this happens constantly. You check something once a day and assume stability. You look at a relationship once a month and assume calm. You only see sparse snapshots, so the gaps feel smooth. But the gaps are where reality hid the motion. That is not the world deceiving you. That is your pipeline undersampling the signal. Compression is the next brutality. Compression means choosing what to forget. And all functioning minds do this constantly. You do not store every leaf. You store tree. You do not store every vibration of a sentence. You store insult, or I comfort, or warning. Compression makes life workable. It also makes experience feel cleaner than raw reality is. The mess got thrown away upstream. That is why confident narratives can be so deceptive. A clean story is often a compressed story. And compressed stories can feel more real than they deserve. Then interpretation arrives. And interpretation is where the pipeline becomes an active sculptor. Because now the system is not just passing along data. It is deciding what the data means. It is matching patterns, inferring hidden causes, deciding what counts as signal and what counts as noise. And here is the hard truth. Interpretation always uses priors. Always. There is no perception without expectation. If you expect a certain kind of pattern, you are primed to notice it. That is not a flaw. It is survival. Without priors, the world is just unranked chaos. But priors can also mislead. One pipeline says this fluctuation is normal. Another says this fluctuation is the start of a runaway problem. One sees noise. Another sees a signature. Sometimes the better pipeline is the more trained one. Sometimes the worse pipeline is the more frightened one. Sometimes it goes the other way. That is why calibration matters so much. Now we are ready for one of the most painful conclusions in the whole model. A pipeline can fail in two ways that feel identical from the inside. It can miss a real signal, or it can hallucinate one, and both will feel like reality. Because you never get raw reality. You get output. That is why confidently wrong pipelines are so dangerous. A pipeline that admits uncertainty can be annoying, but a pipeline that prints a clean story with false confidence can move crowds, ruin decisions, distort lives, and create whole imaginary worlds. History is full of this. Science is full of this too. which is why good science became obsessed with self-skepticism. Astronomers once thought they saw canals on Mars, not because Mars changed, because a pipeline with limited resolution, pattern, hungry eyes, and eager interpretation manufactured a story from blurry input. Better access arrived. The story died. Mars did not change. The pipeline did. That lesson should stay with you permanently. If you want to trust your view of reality, you need to understand how the view is manufactured. This is why mature science is not just observation. It is pipeline discipline. It builds instruments, tests calibration, subtracts contaminants, uses null controls, repeats measurements, checks whether the signal survives different processing choices. And that is an important phrase here. Survives different processing choices. Because if a signal vanishes every time you change one little pipeline setting, maybe the signal was never robust in the first place. Now, let's translate that into human life. A lot of people do the exact opposite. They find one way of processing events that produces a clean story, and then they fall in love with the story. They do not ask whether the pattern survives changes in the pipeline. They do not ask what it would look like if the story were false. They do not ask what noise could imitate the signal. They do not ask whether the timing is clean. They just enjoy the moment where a messy world becomes narratively neat. And that is how hallucinated reality wins. This is why I think one of the most important habits a serious person can develop is an access audit, not a mystical ritual. A practical audit. What is my latency here? What is my noise floor? What am I directly observing versus inferring? What assumptions am I sneaking in? What am I missing between samples? What would still look the same if my story were wrong? That is how you start acting like an embedded observer instead of a spoiled one. Because spoiled observers assume clean access by default. Real observers know better. Now I want to make the next leap, because this is where everything we've said so far starts to connect to agency. Once you understand the observer's pipeline, you stop asking childish questions, like, do I have the truth? You start asking sharper questions. How much access do I really have? How timely is it? How fragile is it? How much of my certainty is pipeline confidence versus real robustness? And then another question appears right behind it. Even if I have access, does that give me leverage? And the answer, very often, is no. This is the harsh turn. A pipeline can be very good at delivering incoming traces, while being terrible at supporting outgoing influence. You can see clearly and still fail to steer. You can have accurate warnings and weak leverage. You can know and still not be able to turn. That sounds tragic, but it is often just physics. The incoming channel and the outgoing channel are not the same thing. They do not have the same delays. They do not have the same noise floor. They do not have the same bottlenecks. This is why the modern world feels so psychologically strange. We are getting better and better at extracting structure from reality. Better sensors, better dashboards, better models, better forecasts. And yet, very often, the path from seeing to changing is still weak, delayed, or crowded with noise. So what happens? You get a civilization full of increasingly sharp warnings and increasingly confused responsibility. People think, if we can see it, why can't we stop it? Because seeing and steering are different channels. That is not an excuse. It is an architectural fact. And that is the bridge to where we are going next. Because once the observer becomes a pipeline, agency also has to become operational. Not a mood, not a self-help slogan. Not just, I feel like I can make a difference. Agency becomes a measurable question about whether action leaves a detectable signature later. Whether the outgoing pipeline still couples strongly enough to matter above noise and delay. That is the next hard turn in the series. And honestly, it is where VTM stops sounding like a philosophy of time and starts sounding like a physics of leverage. Before I close, I want to land this episode in the most human way possible. A lot of people suffer because they keep mistaking a clean internal story for clean access. They think, this is how it feels to me, therefore this is what is happening. Or they think, it became visible now, therefore it became real now. Or they think, I noticed it, therefore I should be able to control it. These are deeply human mistakes, but they are still mistakes. The pipeline view gives you a kinder and more exact language. Maybe the event was real long before it became visible. Maybe the trace arrived late. Maybe the signal was weak. Maybe the pipeline compressed too aggressively. Maybe the interpretation layer was fragile. Maybe your certainty came from presentation, not from robustness. Maybe the world was always the world. And what changed was what your channels could deliver. That is not a small insight. That is a major correction in how to live. Because once you stop worshipping the story and start interrogating the channel, you become harder to fool by other people, by institutions, by devices, by your own mind. And honestly, that is one of the real goals of this whole framework. Not to make time sound mysterious, to make experience more intelligible. Okay, let's close with the simplest summary possible. You do not experience raw reality. You experience the output of a pipeline. That pipeline turns events into traces, traces into signals, signals into records, and records into belief. Every stage imposes limits. Bandwidth limits what can pass through. Noise contaminates what arrives. Latency delays what becomes accessible. Sampling creates gaps. Compression discards detail. Interpretation uses priors and can either reveal structure or hallucinate it. The present, therefore, is not a universally highlighted slice of the cosmos. It is the moving boundary between what your pipeline has delivered and what it has not yet delivered. That boundary is why time feels directional. Your record grows. Your memory accumulates. Your axis changes. And once you understand that, you also understand why different people can inhabit different practical realities inside the same world. Their pipelines differ. Their records differ. Their certainty differs. And their actions are shaped by what their channels made legible. That is the observer as pipeline. Okay? In episode 11, we are going to take the next step. Because once you understand that knowing comes through one kind of channel and acting goes through another, the next obvious question is this: how do you tell whether an action actually leaves a detectable signature later? How do you separate real influence from wishful thinking, from confounding, from noise, from the feeling of control? In other words, when does knowledge remain strong while influence has already faded? That is where we're going next. Thank you for listening. My name is Ralph Clayton. This was episode 10 of the Volumetric Time Model series. And next time, we begin turning this into an operational theory of influence. See you soon.